Imagine a time machine. It opens in a candlelit Leipzig church, and out steps Johann Sebastian Bach. Powdered wig, steady eyes, fingers stained with harpsichord oil. The machine whirs, and suddenly Bach finds himself in a haze of cigarette smoke, tape reels, and the unmistakable hum of an electric guitar. Abbey Road, 1967. Two musical universes collide. What would they say to one another? What would they understand? And what would leave them speechless? This is not just a fanciful meeting, it's a way to ask a serious question. How did the language of Baroque counterpoint actually make its way into the pop rock vocabulary of the Beatles? And how might Bach have reacted to the Beatles' studio alchemy? The Beatles were not a Baroque quintet, but traces of classical training and listening run through their music. Paul McCartney and George Harrison both knew of Baroque and classical music, hearing it from their youth. McCartney has explicitly linked his guitar picking on Blackbird to his and George's early attempts at Bach's Bourrée in E minor. That memory is McCartney's own. He's said the Bourrée was something he and George, quote, poked around on as teenagers, and that its pattern helped him shake Blackbird. Their producer, some call him the fifth Beatle, George Martin, brought real classical training into the studio. Martin studied composition and orchestration, and crucially knew how to write for classical players, score string parts, and translate pop ideas into notated chamber textures. Martin's role in arranging and scoring songs like Eleanor Rigby and helping the Beatles realize studio experiments can't be overstated. Beyond Paul and George's youthful fiddling around, several Beatles tracks show explicit classical gestures. Paul's idea to use a piccolo trumpet on Penny Lane came after he saw a trumpeter play Bach's Brandenburg Concerto on television, and promptly asked that player, David Mason, to record the solo. Let's be concrete. Blackbird bears structural echoes of the Bourrée in its guitar figuration and voice-leading approach. Not a direct quotation, but a clear lineage from a Baroque lute idiom to a 20th century acoustic ballad. That's Paul's own attribution. Because is another neat example of classical layering. John Lennon reportedly formed the chordal bed for the song by asking Yoko Ono to play the opening of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata backwards. The resulting sonority and texture is built of tightly stacked triads that create a kind of modern slow-moving figuration, unusual for pop vocals, but evocative of classical harmony turned inside out. And then there's the Beatles' appetite for counterpoint and complex textures. Think of the layered vocal parts of Because, or the interweaving guitar lines on mid-period tracks. These are not fugues in the Bach sense, but they're siblings, multiple melodic lines moving simultaneously with an internal logic. Now imagine Bach listening. He sits there in the studio. What would he admire? First, structure. Bach prized clarity of musical argument. The Beatles, at their best, write songs with airtight musical logic. Not necessarily long fugues, but nevertheless designs that move with rhetorical purpose. He'd recognize sophistication in their harmonic daring, sudden modal shifts, chromatic bass lines, voice-leading choices that lead to strong, inevitable cadences. Second, Bach would likely be fascinated by their text painting and rhetorical directness. Much of Bach's sacred work is about clear communication of feeling. The Beatles do the secular equivalent, compressing a potent emotional idea into 3 minutes. Bach might call that efficient theology. But here's where Bach might raise an eyebrow. Amplification and electronics would certainly be alien. A harpsichordist suddenly confronted with electric overdrive and tape splicing might find the sound crude or miraculous, depending on his temperament. The Beatles often relied on studio technology as a compositional tool. Tape loops, reversed sounds, mellotron textures, processes that produce sounds unattainable on acoustic instruments and that are not easily captured in a score. Bach might have another objection: the informality of pop performance. Much of what made the Beatles great come from rehearsal room spontaneity, improvisation, and even studio accidents, music that was often not fully notated. For a composer who spent decades perfecting the written fugue, the lack of a definitive score could feel like musical sloppiness, though this is interpretive, of course. Picture the short scene. Bach slips into Studio 2 during A Day in the Life sessions. He watches as an orchestra is instructed to crescendo into a massive sound. Not a written fugue, but a graphic instruction toward chaos. He hears Lennon and McCartney stack three-part close harmonies on Because, creating a cathedral of voices without a single bar of figured bass. The sight of George Martin, pen in hand, translating pop ideas into classical scores might reassure him. They talk, or we imagine they talk. Bach asks what the songs are about. Lennon says, life and the evening news. McCartney hums a little Bourrée-tinged figure, and Bach smiles. He recognizes the craft. Lennon asks, could you write a fugue about love? Bach replies, in the spirit of the meeting, all my music is about the ordering of love, whether for God or for men. In the end, the meeting is a reminder that musical languages travel. Bach didn't write pop songs, of course, and the Beatles didn't write fugues, yet both were masters of texture, voice leading, and of expressing big human things in musical terms. The Beatles took some classical gestures, the piccolo trumpet, string quartets, contrapuntal layering, and translated them into the most pervasive musical idiom of the 20th century. And Bach, if he had listened closely, which we're sure he would have done, would have heard in them something of his own craft, the insistence on clear musical argument and the joy of invention. If you enjoyed this musical time travel, please like and subscribe, and let me know which meeting you want next. Mozart versus Motown, Debussy meets Dylan. See you in the next time machine.